Hello, my name's Adam Penny. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the co-founder of The Beautiful Truth. I hope you'll find this an inspiring, informative, and enjoyable Friday lunchtime as we delve into rewilding in Britain, understanding what it is, what it isn't, and how business can get on board and support. Joining me are going to be three rewilding experts. Sarah King from Rewilding Britain, which is an organization that uses many methods to promote and enable rewilding across England, Scotland, and Wales. Ivan de Clee from Nattergal, which is an organization that defines its purposes to create serious, focused investment into the restoration of terrestrial and marine ecosystems across the planet. And the wonderful Jonathan Thompson, who started his own rewilding project in 2014 on the Wiltshire-Dorset border under Hillwood Nature Reserve, and he's the author of How to Rewild. Before we hear from them, we're going to watch our new film about Jonathan, actually, called Rewilding. We met Jonathan a few years ago, and we were pretty inspired by his story and what he was doing. And we also were lucky enough to visit Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. It's an incredible place. And the film really tells the story of Jonathan and gives you a sense of the reserve. The film's about 10 minutes long, after which we'll hear from our panelists. And there's also a chat function. So if you have any questions or comments, there's a chat function in the YouTube channel there, I think to the right. So you can put any comments in there. However, for this to work, you will have to have signed into your Google or YouTube account. If you don't have one of those, you can also tweet us. So please enjoy the film.
We're an urbanised society in Britain. In fact, in most of the world now, people are urbanised. What I find when people from urban centres coming here is there's a passivity in their engagement. I can see it on their faces. They're walking through this landscape and they're not engaging in it with any depth because they don't know what they're looking at. So they can't see the beauty, they can't see the diversity, they can't see the wonder. And if you can't see those things, then when that's under threat, it's very difficult for them to care, right? What I've created here, this is slowly becoming the Blackmore Vale 15,000 years ago. That's what species need. All the species that we have in lowland England, this is their home. I think rewilding has an ability to reconnect people with nature. You come here and you see the complexity. My very early experiences with nature, it was sort of Huckleberry Finn a bit, you know, it was this sort of very visceral, hands-on, just total freedom. We really would leave the house after breakfast without Ealing lines, and the deal was you have to be back for dinner. If you think about what that was, that interaction, we self-educated. It was sort of paradise, you know. I grew up on a farm 3 hours north of Auckland on gravel roads, and all my family farmed. Everybody in New Zealand farmed there. And we'd slaughter our own animals. It was horrendous to watch. When we did it on the farm, Dad would always take the animal out and put it in the cow shed. And it would be separate from the rest of the cows. I've got these memories of the animals being on their own. My brother-in-law had a neighbour called Ben Roberts. One night, Ben slaughtered an animal in the yard with other animals. There was a bull on the other side of the fence, and the bull went off its nut, pawing the ground and bellowing, which added another whole complexity to the sort of psychodrama. There was something completely visceral about that. We never slaughtered animals on the farm like that. It felt sort of wrong. They're not stupid, you know. These are relatively intelligent mammals, aren't they? And I've often thought about that time. All I ever wanted to be as a kid was a farmer. It's the only thing I ever wanted to be was a dairy farmer. And Dad was going to sell the farm, we were going to buy a bigger farm. The whole thing was completely mapped out. At 13, it was in reach. I got hurt at rugby. And so we were packed off to a doctor in Auckland. I remember just verbatim what he said, looking at my parents, not at me, "This boy will never be a farmer." And we sold the farm. I was just completely blown apart. I remember the drive home, just inconsolable. My life suddenly had no meaning. Everything I'd imagined and dreamed of as a young child had gone. What I do remember very specifically then was imagining a new future and how bloody torturous that was. It was really fraught, really fraught. Deeply problematic. I left school, I failed at university, I slightly cobbled together a sort of a diploma for teaching. I think I was sort of completely rudderless for the next 20 years. I always wanted to prove myself, and I'm not quite sure who to. But there was probably an insecurity there. I've just been everything. Been a cook, a fisherman, an accountant. But also had Barcelona, and I was teaching English and fishing. I was taken a couple of times to bullfights, which I just found really difficult. Really difficult. There was a complete brutality to their death, which was like, whoa, and an unfairness in their death. They have these things called picadors, and they disable the bull. They sever a whole lot of muscles along its flank to then slow the bull down. And it's really long, it's really torturous, just as a slow, excruciating, like going and watching a rugby game. They're all rammed in there. And I remember they just glee at this thing, this horror that was unfolding over the slow death of this animal. Me just sitting there going, Jesus Christ, this is like the worst horror movie I've ever been to. And I just could never reconcile that. I had recurring dreams then about bulls and death. Bulls with no skin left on, so just raw flesh. They were always in some sort of fight. The interesting thing, it was always us and the bull, human and bull. It's the way we treat animals. We treat them with complete disrespect. There's a sentientness in them. There's a cognition in them. They're working stuff out. They're thinking. They're looking. I went back to university and became the organizational psychologist and then worked my butt off doing that job. I think after doing that for 15 years, it lost its interest. I'd stopped caring. And if you don't care, you can't do. But I just really stopped all my work and had some fairly painful conversations with people about, sorry, I don't want to do this anymore. I then took a year sabbatical. There's got to be an answer out there, man. There's got to be something, you know. It was quite difficult trying to answer that question. The next sort of thought process was, okay, what do I start doing out there that's going to make a difference? I understood that if you worked with the land in a particular way, you could bring all these species in. Thinking, if I can buy a piece of land, I could do a rewilding project. Underhill Wood was on the market. It was going to go to auction. And I saw the barn and I just thought, man, this is it. In my mind, this is what I've been looking for. And it's interesting, the vision I had back then is exactly where it is now. For me, it was like you can buy a small piece of land and you can have an effect. And this is not vanity. You can do things. I think if people understood the natural world better, they would then be thinking about their impact. If you spend time here and you start deepening your knowledge of ecology, you begin to understand that there's a multiplicity of things that are wrong. Kids go to school and learn about kings and queens and the Tudors, and they haven't got a clue what's going on here now. They just don't have the language. So they can't see because they've not been taught to see. The education program here is switching these kids on. And it's interesting, I don't talk to them about the crisis. That's off the agenda, we don't go there. It's much more a process of hope and engagement and wonder, because I want them to go away from here sort of buzzing. It's amazing what happens here in this tiny little bit of land. And you then think, what would happen if we scaled that? If 30% of the planet was a no-go nature zone? The motivations for this are very different. It's not about me, it's about them. Pushing myself to understand the ecology so it's conducive to them. I don't want it for me. I'm not proving anything to anybody anymore. What I'm doing this for is I want these guys to have a life, to live out their lives in safety.
Great. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I've watched the film several times, and I still find it quite inspiring. I like the the kind of personal aspects of it, as well as this feeling of, okay, well, what is our connection to nature? And but one of the things I know that we didn't cover in the film, and Jonathan, maybe we can start here, is how you actually discovered rewilding. You know, what was it about rewilding that inspired you?
Actually, before I answer the question, Adam, I just want to thank you for the film and putting today on and those sorts of things.
No, real
Thank you very
pleasure.
much. It's interesting. I think I slightly misspeak in the film. I'm not sure I was aware of the concept of rewilding, given the fact that, next year we're in our 10th year. Certainly reading something like Feral in 2013. So I read that as a hardback when it was initially published, and then using that to sort of explore some of Franz Vera's ideas. But I don't think I'd really thought about buying Underhill Wood as a rewilding project. I think that came a little later.
Okay.
I was inspired by, there were sort of two people who inspired me, which then led us to buy Underhill Wood. One was, we went to a talk, Kegan, my wife and I, Kegan and I went to a talk by somebody called Rory Mackenzie Davey, who'd written a book called Dragonfly Diaries.
Okay.
And Rory Mackenzie Davies was the founder of the Dragonfly Society, and they'd bought a piece of land specifically to create a dragonfly reserve. That was then followed by the visit to by a visit to somebody called Patricia Stanton in the Brew Valley near Bruton, and Patricia had 40 acres, which now we would call rewilding. She'd had this land for 30 odd years. So I think those things informed this idea that we would buy land and we would then shape the land. I'm not sure we gave it that label.
Okay.
Clearly, those two individuals were inspirational for us, without a shadow of doubt.
And was it easy to do?
Which bit was easy to do?
Was it easy to rewild Underhill Wood Nature Reserve?
It's still going on. It's a non-stop process.
Right.
So there were some fundamental things we did. So you can see behind my screen is this. In shot is a lake. So we did one or two large interventions when we first bought the land. Since then, there have been a number of small interventions. One of the things I talk about when I run my rewilding workshops, and indeed I mention in the manual, is at large scale, and well, I think we'll come on to this later in the conversation, you're using ungulates, you're using animals to intervene and disturb and disrupt and create habitats. I take that role at Underhill Wood. So I talk about sort of thinking like an auric. So for me, there's something about me intervening in the land in a way that is beneficial to the land and then to a variety of species to create a series of habitats. So what I'm aiming to achieve is a mosaic, heterogeneity, so as many habitats as I can within the space that I've got. And that's an ongoing process. It's a completely ongoing process. You know, at the moment I'm doing some rotational cutting work at the land to create this sort of mosaic of spaces and habitats. So it never stops.
I think this ongoing thing is something which I remember Ivan talking about actually when I spoke to him. You know, it's not that you're creating just with an end in mind. It's a constant, continuous management when it comes to rewilding. Is that the case?
It is, and as I say, in large-scale projects, animals do it for you. We don't have animals, so I have to do it, right? And there's something about me getting as close as I possibly can to how an animal might intervene.
Right.
And that's quite hard. You know, we're so far removed, and indeed we don't have the tools. There's a great description in Ben McDonald's most recent book about the snout height of a boar, and therefore what a boar does to the topsoil. So I can't even if I'm creating scrapes, for example, at the land and exposing soil, I can't become the boar snout, you know. So these are all sort of very, very poor approximations. But I think there's something about at least trying to imagine, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I do, you know.
What do you think are some of the sort of common misconceptions when it comes to rewilding?
I think there's a few. I went to a talk recently where the person who closed the event said something about he wasn't sure about rewilding because he didn't want Britain flooded with lynx and wolves. So I think there's this idea that it's about sort of reintroducing sort of charismatic megafauna, and it's not necessarily right. I think Scotland certainly there's a place for lynx in Scotland without a shadow of doubt for deer management. But I think there's an oversimplification. I think it's mostly that people don't understand. I think another misconception is that it is about sort of shutting the gate on land.
Yeah.
You know, so you're sort of just walking away from something, which goes back to my original answer about intervention. And then I think there's another misconception, another trope, which is about taking land away from food production. Yeah. And you know, Sarah, who's on the panel, her and I've had conversations at length about this. This is about marginal land. It's not about taking highly productive agricultural land out of production to rewild. So, for example, at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve was 25 acres of highly marginal clay land. Okay. What is, in terms of cost benefit, what's the greater benefit? With the land that we own, you could make an argument that there is greater benefit in rewilding than there is in trying to produce food on highly problematic marginal land on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. Sure. And I also think there's something in there then about sort of land use. One of the sort of statistics I use at my workshop is 20% of UK land is used to shoot game birds. Right. That's a significant amount of our land mass is used by a tiny number of people to shoot birds for fun. And most of those animals aren't eaten. They're not part of our food supply chain. So I think there's there's noise around rewilding, which, you know, I guess it's to be expected, right? You know, if you go to Knepp or you come to Underhill Nature Reserve or you go somewhere else, there's a requirement for a shift in sensibility. You know, people ask me about when am I going to tidy the land up? Right. It's looking messy. And it's a shift. You know, when am I going to when am I going to do something about the hedges?
Yeah.
So there's a requirement for people to look differently at land.
Mm.
And for some people that takes a while, that sort of re-education.
Sure. So Sarah, let's come to you. Rewilding Britain, it's one of the first rewilding organisations in the UK. Tell us about how it came to be and what your purpose is.
Sure. Well, I think it's always worth remembering that rewilding as a whole in Britain is actually still a really new concept and a new movement. So there's some pioneering projects that have been rewilding, even if they haven't been using that term for quite a few years now. But on the whole, it's quite a new thing. And as Jonathan was saying, we've got to change our thought process and how we perceive land as a result of that. So Rewilding Britain's a charity. It formed in 2015, so it's only 7 years old at the moment. And really it was formed in response to a need to look at land management differently. I'm not going to go too much into the negatives, but we've been facing a biodiversity crisis for quite a long time now. We need to do things differently. So the charity was set up in response to that, to try and show that there is a different approach in the right place and that we can start to reverse those declines in biodiversity through a combination of different approaches, and rewilding really should be one of those approaches. So we are a small charity. We're growing increasingly as the movement starts to build, and we're really seeing rewilding grow in popularity over the last few years especially. But really we're aiming to raise awareness of what rewilding is, trying to change mindsets of how it can help us, influencing policy along the way as well, because we need to have policy and change in the legislation to allow some of these things to happen, but also trying to help support projects on the ground, help facilitate some of that knowledge exchange, because it is still a really new concept. And I think it's just, something that's really important. The rewilding is happening, and we're trying to influence policy and engagement to allow it to catch up and show the benefits of it.
Right. And you guys talk about benefiting people, nature, and climate. So can you break those down for us and what that benefit means?
Sure. So what we've seen through rewilding projects on the ground, and they're still incredibly new still in terms of the length that we're looking at with ecosystem change. But what we've seen from projects like Underhill, NEP, across the board, is a real explosion of life and the return of nature. There's a phrase that's used along a lot of rewilding projects of build it and they will come. And that's certainly something that we see with nature, is that you put the pieces in place and things come back remarkably quickly in some cases, which is really exciting to see. And we start to see wildlife come back to areas that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it as well, which is increasing our knowledge of it. I think it's also worth recognizing that we're part of nature and we shouldn't really be excluding ourselves from that. So one of the benefits of rewilding is that it creates really high quality environments for us to go and enjoy, walk around, see the wildlife, see nature. But through the work that we're doing and through the projects we're working with, we're also building an evidence base for the role of people within these rewilding projects. And what we're seeing across the rewilding network is that within 10 years, jobs are increasing by 65%. Wow. We're seeing a 13-fold increase in volunteer opportunities on rewilding projects. And what we're also starting to see is rewilding projects are delivering on social and green prescribing. So this is where you are prescribing activities and enjoyment of the outdoors to help improve your own mental and physical health. And they're also supporting wellbeing and education programs. So there's very much a role of people there. And then finally, in terms of climate, we're seeing a whole range of what we call ecosystem services being delivered through rewilding projects, whether that's improving our water quality, helping to mitigate flood through slowing the flow and having beavers there that are helping to slow that flow down and actually act as flood mitigation. We're seeing cleaner air, and also we're starting to see carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of studies around how rewilding projects and how that dynamic landscape can store and sequester an awful lot of carbon. So when we're looking at the climate impacts as well, they're quite multiple and significant.
Yeah, I think the thing that fascinated me the most when we spoke yesterday was this idea that people go to the doctor and they're prescribed to go and spend time in nature, and that's something that is just, I'm like, wow, I hadn't even thought that would be a thing. And then are they going to rewilding reserves?
That's right. So rewilding projects will be approved suppliers of these programs, and then they'll encourage people from deprived backgrounds or people who are facing mental health issues or physical health issues to go and follow a program that will help them to not only enjoy and learn about that rewilding project, but also help their own health.
Okay, that's amazing. I want to come on to you, Ivan. Tell me about Nattergal, because you're taking a slightly different approach to rewilding, and something which is quite innovative and new.
Adam, do you mind if I go back to one of your earlier questions quickly?
Please do.
It's about food systems and food production, and this fantasy that we can't have rewilding and food production at the same time. And Jonathan rightly pointed out that this is largely rewilding targeted at marginal land. That said, we are in the most catastrophic biodiversity collapse. You know, when biodiversity goes, we produce no food because ecosystems are broken. So the idea that we'll just do a little bit of marginal rewilding over there and a little bit over there is not going to, in inverted commas, save the world. We need big change, and we need to work out how to do it and feed ourselves at the same time. And part of that is rethinking the way we produce food, the way we feed ourselves. And so one of the projects that I'm working on with Nattergal, and I'll talk about it in a second, it's 1,500 acres. So I think Underhill Wood Reserve is maybe around 50 or 100 acres. So a lot bigger. We're talking about big projects, previously growing wheat and beans. And those wheat and beans, at the moment, the beans are shipped off to Scandinavia to be turned into fish food to feed fish and fish farms in Scotland. So we've got a very weird system there. And our wheat, and our wheat is going into feed pigs and chickens in sheds. So it's grade 3 land, which is the sort of third most productive, but not very good. Not grade 1, grade 2, which is where we grow all our vegetables. So this idea that we're taking all of this land out of production that feeds human beings, if we reduce our meat or fish consumption by 10, 20%, you're suddenly releasing huge swathes of land that could be these completely biodiverse ecosystems. And then we're doing nature, we're growing food, we're doing all of these things. And you've got this horrible polarized debate at the moment where it's rewilding at one end, intensive food production at the other end. And you have everything in between, which is nature-friendly farming. We have huge areas of the UK growing crops for biofuels, maize, 300,000 hectares of corn that gets chucked in a biodigester to make energy. We've got pony paddocks, we've got golf courses. Land use is so complex, and it's often oversimplified, i.e., you've got to farm it to feed ourselves, or you can rewild it and we'll all starve. And it's just so reductive, and it sends me up the wall. and particularly against the backdrop of Ukraine and Russia, the horrible conflict, the wheat exports, everyone thinks, oh my goodness, we've got no food. The entire shortfall of wheat imports into Europe from the Ukraine-Russian conflict, if the Europeans made a 30% reduction in our poultry and pork consumption, so let's say a sandwich every 2 days less, or a couple of sandwiches less that has chicken in, we would have made up for the entire shortfall of wheat that's being imported into Europe. So whilst we all get in a total spin about food production, there's something like, you have to find the reference for this, but 1.7 times the amount of calories on Earth to feed the current global population. So there's lots of calories around, but how we grow it and how we use them and how we shift them and distribute them around the world, there is a happy balance of big nature and food as well. That's my rant over. I'm so sorry.
So looking at something that's much more integrated, and I think, but I want to focus on the UK specifically, because this figure of 30% is something that the government is talking about in terms of 30% of rewilding. Where are we on that?
I think it's 30% protected area rather than 30% rewilding.
Okay.
Sarah, what's your target for rewilding UK landmass? Maybe 5%?
Yeah, so I can come in on this. So the government's committed to, as you say, 30% protected areas in nature recovery. At the moment, they've currently assessed that we're at 3% on land and 8% at sea. So there's quite a way to go on that in terms of achieving that policy goal of 30%.
Okay.
And then, Sarah, I think your Rewilding Britain's target for rewilding is 5%, isn't it?
5% core area, and then 25% in somewhere along that rewilding spectrum. So rewilding, nature recovery, and that's land and sea.
Okay, and then Ivan, tell us about Nattergal, because from what I understand, it's very business focused. Because I think a lot of rewilding is seen as a nice to have, but the way that you guys are focusing on it is something that's quite different.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, conservation and rewilding up until now has largely been funded by philanthropy and government. And although they've done some incredible projects and they've held on to some of the nature we have around the world and in this country, ultimately it's failed. We're in a biodiversity collapse. So the way Nattergal are approaching things is we need massive mainstream investment. We need lots of money to come into nature. And the way we think we can do that is by turning rewilding and nature conservation into a profitable business. Not making loads of money. We're not going to be selling oil and gas, but we hope to be able to sell nature and build businesses around nature, whether it's ecotourism or selling biodiversity or selling carbon sequestration. We have designed a model that investors happily have decided stands up to scrutiny, and we've raised some money to go out and buy land and restore it to nature and be able to generate a return for those investors.
So there's sort of direct return on investment.
Exactly, yeah. It's a company, so our investors will be getting a long-term, ethical, sustainable return on investment.
And you were saying earlier that's something to do with sort of credits that people can buy.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking at natural capital as a major income stream, and natural capital is very basically nature. It's your stock of nature. But the way you can capitalize on that is working out what your nature provides for society, and they're called ecosystem services, which have a value and have always had a value to society, but haven't always been paid for, known as public goods. So you don't trade them over the counter. Traditionally, we've been getting clean water, clean air, biodiversity from all of these amazing systems, but no one's ever paid for them. Hence, they've been destroyed because they didn't have a value. So what we're trying to do is work out what nature we have, what rewilding will do, i.e. increase the biodiversity, clean the water, sequester the carbon, and then find the markets to take those credits of biodiversity, those credits of carbon, and sell them to corporates or individuals for people who want to get to net nature positive as a business, or net zero carbon as a business, or they just want to be an individual who's supporting something amazing, and they're contributing to a national recovery of biodiversity.
Okay, so I want to sort of open it up to everybody in terms of, because for me this is the key focus, is how do you make rewilding not a nice to have and make it sort of a business imperative? How can we get businesses involved? And what are going to be their benefits beyond the ones that you've just mentioned? Sarah, do you want to sort of jump in on that? What benefit would it bring a business beyond sort of carbon credits or the like?
I think there's a lot of there's an increased interest in environmental sustainability and the environmental credentials of a lot of businesses. So there's a lot of stories that can be told from these various rewilding projects, especially if your company or your headquarters is close to a rewilding project. You can get people out there having a look at it, understanding it, and then potentially telling that story of how you're making a difference on the ground in Britain. There's also a lot of projects offer corporate volunteering and opportunities to get out and give back to rewilding projects, whether that's through helping out with various tasks, especially in terms of tree planting or any habitat restoration works that's happening at the start of a project, or even just getting involved with some of the wellness and education programs that are happening. So I think there's a lot of offering there, not just in terms of putting money into these projects and getting that return, but actually having a much more hands-on role and going out and enjoying, and then providing that education and experience for your employees so that they can then understand nature, get involved in nature, and then spread that message further.
And are you seeing companies take this up in the UK already? Are you seeing this already a sort of going
increasingly program? So, yeah. I think a lot of companies in the UK have historically maybe invested quite a lot into overseas schemes. And I think what we're seeing, especially from COVID, is there's a much more of a focus on what's on our doorstep. We really need to be leading the way with nature recovery and biodiversity, there's a lot of work to do back at home. So I think there's that increasing focus now.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when I think, and with the work that we've done with some of our clients, when I think about conservation, or I think about biodiversity, I think about not cutting down rainforests, or whether that's in Indonesia or the Amazon, or I think about how we're protecting reefs. But to bring it back to something that's actually here, I think also makes it quite tangible, because I think there's this concern that we aren't connected to nature. We don't understand this connection to nature in absolute enough terms. How do we bring that to people?
What we're also seeing in the UK is more extreme weather events, which brings with it more flash flooding, heat waves like in the summer. So we really need to start looking after those natural solutions to some of these things, in terms of, can we start to mitigate some of that flooding? Can we bring beavers back that help keep our wetlands in times of drought? So I think there's a really important message there for our own well-being.
It's interesting, Adam, when I go back to New Zealand, I think there's 2 points that I'll just lob in here.
Please.
I think there's some sort of reality that we live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Britain, in the IUNC index, we sit near the bottom. Right. So I think, I'm not sure there's much awareness of that. The other thing that I was saying, it goes back to my point in the film about being an urbanized society. When I go back to New Zealand, and given the fact when I was born, 80% of New Zealand farmed, the population were farmers, right? So cities, when I was a kid in New Zealand, were tiny because people were on the land. When I go back to New Zealand, the amount of sort of environmental literacy and ecological literacy amongst the general population is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It's really high. So when the New Zealand government wants to create 25% of the coastline as no-take marine conservation zones, that's embraced by the population, because they understand there's a greater connectedness, right? And you talked to me about this last time when we were talking, that you grew up as a city lad, and perhaps your parents did as well. There is in Britain, we don't have enough of the population who are connected with our terrestrial, or indeed our marine landscape. Yeah.
And then the challenge is then, as you said in the film, if you don't see it, how do you know what you're trying to protect? If you don't understand that language, how is it that we can have the conversation or talk about those things that we're trying to protect when we walk into nature?
I think rivers are a great example, and Sarah referenced beavers storing water during drought, but everyone, or a lot of people, have been engaged with the sewage situation in England at the moment. And there was that video of sewage going out to sea a few weeks ago, and our rivers in such a terrible state. As soon as you start explaining and actually showing, and then helping people see, as Jonathan says, that a wetland but downstream of a sewage works will clean the river for you, and whether a beaver does that or a rewilding project through a series of interventions does that, people go, oh my goodness, this is really important, because it's stopping blue roll flushing up on my beach or whatever, because everyone's beginning to go, okay, nature is playing a real role in our lives here. And then people get, the Net Estate, the kind of well-known West Sussex rewilding project, has started a tourism business, camping, glamping, and safaris. And we are sold out for safaris from April to the end of October. 60, 70 people a day paying money to come and learn about nature. Not all of them have a background or an understanding of nature, but there's a real hunger for people to see, and there's a hunger for people to find some hope. And rewilding is very, very hopeful, because you're taking a low baseline and ecologically poor place and letting nature come back. So in the face of all the doom and gloom, and it's all, as you rightly pointed out, helping this urbanized society, or people go, oh yeah, we do have nature here, and it has the capacity to recover, and you can go and enjoy it and see it and receive all these amazing ecosystem services from it.
And it's tangible. So I was saying to Jonathan yesterday, it's something that's tangible. A lot, I think, the problems that we face is when we talk about the climate and when we talk about the environment, it's very difficult for people to see or understand. But when you talk about something tangible like a rewilding project, or tangible like that, it becomes a different conversation. So we've got time just for a few questions. So Climate Action North are tuned in. Hello, Climate Action North. Thanks for joining us. We're very interested. They're saying we're very interested in Ivan's business model, as this will really be appealing to the businesses we work with, especially as they work towards net zero and decarbonization strategies. Sounds great. And they agree with Sarah that we're seeing our corporate sponsors wanting to invest in UK-based rewilding projects. The question for Ivan is, are you able to quantify specific carbon savings on your projects?
Yeah, well, that's the key. So the markets as they exist at the moment, the natural capital markets are very heavily stacked in favor of carbon. So you can go and plant an area of woodland, you can make a few models guessing how well those trees will grow, and that will sequester an amount of carbon, and you can sell that. Rewilding isn't so focused on tree planting. It likes nature to do the regeneration for it. It likes the natural processes to function. So it's a lot more random, unpredictable, heterogeneous, and is ever evolving. So there's no end state. So trying to quantify that is the big challenge, because once you learn how to quantify it and measure it as time goes on, then you can sell that carbon or demonstrate that carbon savings for whichever corporate needs them. So what we're doing at Nattergal is leading with biodiversity, because if you lead with carbon, you're going to go down a tree planting route, because that's where the market will take you. We want to lead with biodiversity, create new markets around selling biodiversity, not for net zero, but for net nature benefit, which is around the corner for all of your guests today. Everyone's going to start reporting on nature soon as well as carbon, and that's great. And what we're going to do is, as our biodiversity improves, as our trees recover, as our soils recover, and all this carbon is being drawn down from the atmosphere, we are going to measure. And actually this summer at Nattergal, we took over 1,000 soil cores. We've done LiDAR mapping of our vegetation. We are going to record every bit of carbon that goes down into that system. And we will demonstrate massive savings, massive sequestration, well, we expect to. And we will sell that to support the business. And then the business, the corporates buying that off us will get to their net zero targets by supporting rewilding projects.
I think one of the things just to note, building on Ivan's point, is that when we're looking at carbon, we're simplifying it, which is why you then go down potentially the tree planting route. With rewilding, it's much more complex than that. So the team at Nattergal and a lot of other rewilding projects are having to measure different metrics to show different things, whether it's soil or vegetation or biodiversity, to then be able to show what that impact and what that uplift is across the rewilding project. So that's still being developed alongside the rewilding that we're still getting on with, because we can't wait for that metric to be finalized before we get on with things, because there is an urgency to it. So they're being developed side by side, which is really exciting to see.
Excellent. Fantastic. Another question from Gustavo. Talking about the business model, how do you guarantee that land ownership will remain in friendly hands on a timeline that's consistent with selling credits?
Something called a conservation covenant. So the land might be sold, but the contract for delivering that ecosystem is a legal contract. So the buyer will have to inherit that delivery. So, a carbon contract might be 100 years. Biodiversity is going to be 30, 35 years. You can dictate the length of your project, but yeah, that's how you guarantee it. The way we've structured Nattergal is not to be a fund, an investment fund, but a company. So because we want these pieces of land to be in nature for the rest of time in perpetuity, we don't want to ever have to sell them. And if we were structured as a fund, and investor A wanted to retrieve their £5 million, we might be forced into selling an asset to give them back their money. Whereas if you're buying and selling shares, we'll protect our assets under a series of contracts and covenants to keep that land in nature forever.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, sorry, I'm interrupting again, but conservation covenants are now included in the legislation in Britain. So the Environment Act includes conservation covenants in that, so it's built into legislation as well.
Jonathan, what about you? What's going to happen to Underhill Wood Nature Reserve?
Well, yeah, really good question. At the moment, we have that going. When we sort of head off into the soil, in fact, and replenish something. It's going to a charity. It's slightly unresolved exactly, but we have that in place. It would be interesting to sort of, as we go forward, it would be interesting to sort of tie down how it's managed and what happens there, and indeed what benefits it brings in terms of educating people and children and young people. So there are some things to be worked on as we go forward.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to take one more question. I know we're slightly over time. This is from Luke Hopkins. How much of an impact will planned governmental schemes such as the Environmental Land Management Scheme have, and what are the limitations?
Well, Sarah,
that's your bag. I think that one.
Yeah, I think they're going to make an incredible difference. So the Environmental Land Management Scheme has a tier included called Landscape Recovery, and Nattergal's site and a few other rewilding projects are in that pilot at the moment. And the aim of that is to start paying landowners, land managers, farmers for environmental impact. So these ecosystem services we've been talking about, they'll start getting paid for that. And I think that's incredibly exciting. Landscape recovery in particular is looking at large scale. So we're looking at real landscape scale change through that. So as that starts to come through, and we need to look at the detail and make sure that the funding's secure on that as part of the works we're doing, I think that will be a game changer. I think the credits that are coming through credits coming through will also be really exciting. And we're also seeing agricultural policy change in Scotland and Wales as well. So we're doing a lot of work to make sure that they are also delivering on similar things. But Ivan, you can go in.
I'm just going to chip on ELM's that Environmental Land Management Scheme structure. There are 3 tiers. The first 2 are about nature and environmentally friendly farming, and then the top tier, landscape recovery, which Sarah just referenced, is the sort of land use change rewilding one. What the government want actually through this landscape recovery, and obviously it was under threat with the previous Prime Minister and who knows with the current Prime Minister, but what they want is these big projects to set themselves up to sell ecosystem services to the private sector.
Okay.
So where the government see their role is investing in projects to get them kind of project ready or oven ready, to use Boris's old favorite phrase, oven ready projects for private investment. They want the private sector to pay for nature recovery. And at the moment, you've got this gap between all the people who've joined the webinar today who want to support rewilding. You've got the land managers who say we need money to do rewilding. And where the government is going to try and position itself is facilitating that transfer. And that's a pretty smart move, I would say, because it takes the burden off the public purse. It puts it in the hands of the corporates who have ESG and net zero targets, and it potentially will facilitate massive change. Just need to get on with it.
We scale things up, I think, so it's incredibly exciting.
Good to hear. So we're over time. We're at 1:50. So I guess I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time, all of you. 3 different perspectives, and it's been wonderful to hear you. I'm going to say that if people or businesses want to get involved, I'll make sure that they have your contact details, because I'm sure that you'd be delighted to hear from them. But thank you also everybody who tuned in. We will be sending out the recording, so if you didn't manage to make it, we'll make sure that it's shared with you. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Adam, thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you,
To you guys.
Cheers.